Well, I've been telling you all along that the assumption that we've been making so far is that an atom is going to have the same number of protons as it does electrons because we're going to assume that those atoms are all neutral. Well, today that's going to change. And so I'm going to teach you about what happens when an atom gains or loses electrons. Now, keep in mind that the structure of the atom is that the protons and the neutrons are in the middle and the electrons are on the outside. So if it's going to gain or lose something, electrons would be the most logical thing for it to gain or lose because they are the ones on the outside. The protons and the neutrons are so deep down inside that it's much more difficult to lose those things. So if you gain or lose, and it can be either way, electrons, you form what's called an ion, okay? An ion, that just means it's an atom that has a charge on it. And there are two types of ions. You can have a cation, which basically means that you have lost electrons, and so a cation is going to have a positive charge. The other type of ion is an anion, which is formed when you gain electrons, and it will then have a negative charge to it. Okay, so the thing to remember about formation of ions is that you're gaining or losing electrons, and electrons have a negative charge. So let's do an example, so hopefully that will make a little bit more sense. Let's take lithium. And if you look at the periodic table, lithium is on the left-hand side in the second row, and you can see that lithium has 3 protons because its atomic number is 3. That's the number that's up in the upper left-hand corner. And so if it is neutral, it's going to have 3 electrons as well. And your protons and your electrons are equal in charge, opposite in magnitude. I said that backwards. Opposite in charge, equal in magnitude. Sorry about that. And so what then happens if I lose an electron? And so now I'm going to have 3 protons and only 2 electrons. Well, a positive 3 and a negative 2 is going to give you a positive 1. So I have 1 more positive charge than I do negative charge. So what that means is that I'm going to have a lithium atom, and it's going to have a positive charge on it. And I just represent the symbol for this particular cation just by writing the symbol and putting a plus sign up there. Okay, let's do another example. Let's talk about beryllium. Beryllium is right next to lithium on the periodic table. It's in the second column over. It has an atomic number of 4, so that means it has 4 protons, and if it is neutral, it's going to have 4 electrons as well. Let's say that beryllium, again, it's going to still have 4 protons because if it changes the number of protons, it changes the element that it is. But let's say that it loses 2 electrons, and it now has only 2 left over because it's lost 2 of them. So what does that give me? Well, at that point, I'm going to have beryllium, but I've got 2 more positive charges than I do negative charges, so it's going to have a positive 2 charge on it. And the way that I write that is a BE with a 2 plus. I always write the number first and then whatever the charge is afterwards. Okay. One more example of cations. Let's look at aluminum. Okay, aluminum has an atomic number of 11. I'm sorry, an atomic number of 13. No, it is an atomic number of 11. Maybe I should put my glasses on so I could see. Yeah, 13. That's a 13. So it has 13 protons and 13 electrons if it is neutral. And so therefore, if it still has 13 protons, but let's say that it loses 3 electrons this time. And so now I'm going to be down to 10 electrons. So what is that going to look like? Well, that aluminum has 3 more positives than it does negatives, so it's going to have a positive 3 charge. And so it will look like that. Okay? All right, so those are cations where I have lost electrons. Here I've lost 1 electron. Here I've lost 2 electrons. and here I've lost 3 electrons. But now what happens when I gain electrons? Let's look at fluorine as an example. Fluorine has an atomic number of 9, so I would have 9 protons and 9 electrons if it is neutral. But let's say that I'm going to gain 1 electron. So that means I'll have 9 protons and 10 electrons. Well, now I have an additional electron. I have 9 protons, but I have 1 more electron. So that means I have an extra negative charge. And so that means I'm going to have an F with the -1. If it's just a -1, you don't actually have to write the number. Just like with the plus over here, I didn't have to write the number. If you just have the plus or just have the minus, it implies that there's a 1 there. If I take sulfur as an example, sulfur has an atomic number of 16. So if it's neutral, 16 protons, 16 electrons. Let's say that it's going to gain 2 electrons. Well, it's still going to have 16 protons, but now it's going to have 18 electrons. So what's the charge going to be? Well, if I have 2 more negatives than I do positive, that means that I'm going to have a -2 charge. And so that's what the symbol is going to look like there. Okay? So gaining electrons is actually gaining more negative charges, and that will give you a negative charge on the atom, and that is an anion. If you lose electrons, you're losing negative charge, so you have more positive than you do negative, and that will end up with a cation, which has a positive charge. Now, I will make one small note that we're actually going to, again, we'll hit a little bit more later, but when you gain or lose electrons, it's not just that those electrons are going off into outer space someplace. Normally what happens is that you have electrons that are transferring their electrons to each other. So for example, if the lithium is going to lose an electron, it's probably actually giving it to something like the fluorine, which is gaining an electron. So this losing and gaining of electrons is happening in between atoms, but for right now, we're just looking at what happens at an individual atom and then what happens with its particular charge. And we'll worry more about the transfer of electrons a little bit later on.